Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I've been getting a lot of calls, emails, text messages, tweets saying, hey, when's the video on the business cycle coming out? I'd love to see one. So I thought, you know what? Today's as good a day as any. So I got down to it and decided to put together a quick little video on the business cycle. All right, what is the business cycle? It's alternating increases and decreases in economic activity over time. This is what happens in the economy. Okay? There are phases to the business cycle, and there are 4 of them. The first phase is a peak. The peak says that the real GDP is at its highest point and is about to decrease. All right, so we've hit our high and we're about to go down. That leads us into the second phase, which is the recession phase, where real GDP is falling. Okay, real GDP continues to fall until we get to the third stage, which is the trough, which is the bottom of the cycle. And that's when real GDP has hit its lowest point and is about to increase. And then when we begin to increase, we are now in the expansion phase of the business cycle, where real GDP is rising. Right? So we have real GDP at the highest, real GDP falling, real GDP at its lowest, real GDP rising, and repeat. All right, graphically, this is what it looks like. All right. We have our peaks. Okay, let me just get my laser pointer. All right, we have our peaks up here. So we see GDP is up and it's about to go down. This line is the growth trend. Right, we'll talk about that when we get into more about growth. But we did talk about we like to see real GDP rising about 2.5% to 3%. Is probably the more realistic number. Your books and things will say 3 to 5%. I don't know if those, given the structure of the economy these days, if that's possible. But that's what this line would be, a 2% increase from the previous real GDP each year. Okay, and you can see it continues to go up and down. Another way to look at it, okay, is, why we're not changing slides. Okay, so the next one would be the taming of the business cycle. As you can see, this really big trough that we hit, right? So this is the trough. The peak was all the way up here. And again, that's our baseline, right? And then look, again, this is 0% the baseline. Then we have an increase, not nearly as a high of a peak as we had previously, but the trough is also not as low. And then we get to the ending here where you notice that it's like little bumps in there. It's not this big cyclical, it is a cyclical cycle, but it's being stretched out, right? The sine curve is being stretched out because we have new techniques to combat these problems, right? We also have better inventory by managers, so we don't have a lot of inventory sitting on shelves or in parking lots, right, with cars. There's less volatility in the housing sector, and prices are more stable. And fiscal and monetary policy, we've come to understand it a little bit better. So you'll notice again that we just kind of flatten out with little bumps and rises as we go. Okay, now, why does that matter? Okay, because we have a gap in GDP, which is the actual GDP minus potential GDP. This number can be negative or positive, right? And how much does it go down? Well, there's a young woman named Okun who came up with this law that said for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, if you remember from the unemployment video, cyclical unemployment is when people stop buying goods and services, right? People are worried about, just take today. People are concerned. They're not sure if they should be spending. They don't know what's going to happen with this pandemic, when they could be back at work full time, collecting a check. So because of that, they start buying goods and services. That leads to unemployment. That's cyclical unemployment. 1% of it leads to a 2% GDP gap. Okay, so GDP falls by 2% every time we have 1% cyclical unemployment, right? And if full employment is 96%, then full unemployment is 4%, which means everything over 4%, every percentage over 4 will lead to a 2% GDP gap, right? So if we have 7% unemployment, That's 3% cyclical. 3 times 2 is 6, when GDP would drop by 6%. Now let's get a look at what it looks like in the real world, right? So you notice here in the beginning, this is the 1990s going into George W. Bush. This is Clinton and Bush. And you'll notice it really rides that growth rate. Economy's doing well. We have a little bit of a jump up here in the early 2000s. We could argue probably Bush's tax cut. Then we go along, then this is the financial, right? We started to slump a little bit, and then we had this huge financial crisis. And then we're down, and you can see we're fighting, GDP's fighting to get back to the potential. We don't hit there until 2018 or so, which I would argue again is another tax cut, right? This is the Trump tax cut. Back here was the Bush tax cut. Then we're above, and you'll notice then we drop off pandemic, right? So for the last, I guess, since the new century, practically the last 10 to 12 years, we've been not as high above the growth rate, right? Okay, so then let's look at it a little differently, right? This is your business cycle kind of jammed in from the 1950s, right? And these gray areas here are areas of recessions. So you can see how many recessions we've had since the 1950s. And you can see right here was a pretty bad one, right? An almost 10% drop in real GDP. This is pretty bad. This is one of the worst ones, or at least it's the argument I make, because you had this big drop in the 80s. It kind of went up, but we didn't stay there long. We dropped, kind of went up, and then we went back down. So that's a very volatile market where people don't know what to do in that type of market. Then we came out, right? Reagan does, and the Fed does some plans, and then we end up being here. We see positive growth rate till we get to right before the election with Bill Clinton. Right here is George H. Bush coming off the Gulf War, where we're very successful. His popularity rate is very high, but then the economy starts to slump in late August of 91. And that probably cost him the presidency and allowed for this time period here of Bill Clinton. Right? These are some impressive rates of increase. Okay, and then there's a little bit of a slump as 9/11 happens. There was a recession before. Then we kind of do a little bit of a double dip, and then we're back up. And then this falling out again is the financial crisis. And at the end here, they do not have the pandemic. All right, now if I wanted to look at the same thing and just stretch it out from 1970, right, and get it all the way out to 2020, you can now see the drop off over here of 2020, right? And this is a little, it's not as tight, so you can see the spaces. All of this is above, this is growth, right? And you can see, right, if we want to be fair, this is Reagan growth, which is pretty good. This is Clinton growth, which also very good. George W., this is his, but he does leave on the financial crisis when we're going down. All right, so that's your GDP numbers. All right, let's look at some things. Business cycle fluctuations. Why do they happen? Economic shocks. Prices are what we call sticky downwards. You can raise prices very quickly going upwards, right? They're very flexible. However, getting people to take less wages or things like that, or getting stores to lower their price is a little tougher. So the prices are a little sticky, which makes the recovery a little harder. All right? Then we have the economic response entails a decrease in output and employment. All right? So the concerns here is that with these fluctuations, we're losing output, but then we're also going to have some unemployment. So who bears the burden of all this? It is an unequal burden, very similar to today in the pandemic, right? Who's being hurt the most by these economic policies or these scientific policies of shutting the economy down and some lockdowns that are happening in places? Well, it depends on your occupation. As a teacher, a government worker, a lot of us are okay. Cops, firemen, things like that. Depending on your age, the cycle. You get laid off when you're 55, 60 years old, and you were planning on working till you were 65, you're going to have a tough time finding a job. No one's looking to hire someone who's 55. Based on race and ethnicity. Take the pandemic once again, right? This downward turn has hurt minorities the worst. Okay, women are hurt more by this. right? Because we live in a very sexist society. People with less education are hurt, right? And then the duration of it will determine how unequal some of these things are. All right, so what are some of the non-economic costs? What I like about this slide is this is the Republican argument to, well, I guess Donald Trump also said it was, the cure can't be worse than the disease itself, right? So when people are out of work, there's a loss of skills and a loss of self-respect. Morale falls. There's problems within the families, right? Because there isn't money and you're hungry. Poverty and less hope. Heightened racial and ethnic tensions. Well, that doesn't sound like anything that might have happened this summer, right? And then we also talk about suicide, homicide, fatal heart attacks, and mental illness. Again, look at all of these. Pick up the newspaper, go online, Google something that happened somewhere around June when we're talking about we have to open the economy, because all of these things we said were happening, right? Doesn't mean that we're not also having problems with other people aren't having problems, right? So, and then all of this can lead to social and political change. Wow, political change. Maybe a president who gets 74 million votes actually doesn't get elected president. That's a possibility. All right, so there's your business cycle video. I hope it's what you guys were looking for. If not, put a comment in the comment box below, and I will be sure to get back to you. All right, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, have a good day.